Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
When I watch little kids watching cartoons on Saturday mornings, and I look at their blank faces, I somehow have a negative feeling. Intuitively, I'm saying to myself, something's wrong with this. I'd be much happier if those kids were out playing creatively or doing something else or reading a book. They look blank. They look as though they're transported off into some other fantasy kind of world, and I just can't believe that that ends up being healthy for them.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Michael Marsden, Associate Professor of Popular Culture at Bowling Green State University. Today, Father Bacik and Dr. Marsden discuss the way television shapes our consciousness. Here's Father Bacik.
Mike, I'm happy that you have taken time out from a busy schedule to come and discuss with me something about the whole area of television. It's especially appropriate since you teach in that field at Bowling Green and teach courses on media theory and so on, and television and popular culture, and so it's a pleasure to have you here. And I'm going to be addressing the topic from my own theological interest. It might sound like an odd topic for someone who thinks about religious matters to be dealing with, but I think that we'll see as we go along that there's really a lot of connections like that, and that television really has a lot to do with our understanding of the world and our perceptions of ourselves and so on. And that's the way I'd like to zero in this conversation, is the way that television affects our general mentality, our outlook on the world, the way it shapes our consciousness. Well, we've been living with television now, for 25 years or more, and I suppose that the man who first started me thinking along this line was Marshall McLuhan, important figure in this whole area, who died during this year. And I guess the message I got from him was generally that the kind of media that we're involved in determines, to a large measure, how we think about the world, how we function, how our learning process goes, and so on. So maybe we could just spend a little bit of time here at the beginning on McLuhan and some of his theories.
It seems to me the question isn't whether or not the media affect the way we think or our perceptions of the world. It's really a question of coming up with any kind of experience that isn't in some way mass-mediated. You begin to wonder if there is anything which exists outside that frame of reference. McLuhan was not the only one, but he was one of the voices early in the 1960s who began to call attention to the fact that television and the other mass media have radicalized the way in which we look at the world, so that they became the windows for us. They became the filters through which we saw most of the world. And it takes an unusual series of events maybe to shake us up and to realize that something unique is happening here that has never happened before in the history of the world, or certainly we're never going to see the end of in the history of the world.
What I got out of one of the things is his contrasting of the linear culture, the print culture that most of us grew up in, at least in part, while the older people did, but were dominated by books and so on. And I guess his idea was that created a certain kind of logical thinking in which part of the right side of the brain was developed, and that where we tended to think logically, sequentially, and that there was a premise and another premise, and from that followed a conclusion. And that with the advent of the electronic media, with the television and so on, that now we were more bombarded with images and symbols. It was more like the previous pre-literate culture, back to the tribal culture, where very oral culture based on what the hearing and the development of the symbolic side of ourselves, the development of the left side of the brain, I guess, if I've got that correct.
Well, I think that's the key point. The key point is sensual balance. The argument was that linear print had, in fact, separated the author from the audience, that there had been a separation created there, and that media like television, what media like television were doing was simply reestablishing that linkage. And so McLuhan was one of the persons who was saying what a medium like television can do is recreate that balance, so that you have a kind of reintegration of all the senses in the person, a kind of wholeness again. He wasn't the only one, though. People like Father Ong in books like The Presence of the Word. We're talking about the whole concept of the way in which these media have radically changed the way we interact with each other and also with the society. If you go again, tracing back the whole idea of the Word and its origin in print, at least. McLuhan, in a book that's often overlooked, The Gutenberg Galaxy, he talked about the history of print as almost a history of enslavement, because what you had was the concept of print being disseminated among large groups of people and actually being able then to control those people through print. So print wasn't as much of a liberating force as it was maybe even a controlling force for people.
So he took a positive view of the development of television and thought that it was creating a greater wholeness. That's, again, interesting from the theological viewpoint, because what we're always trying to do is look for ways that we can help people to become more mature, developed, whole persons, so that we get our head and heart operating in harmony. And perhaps, at least that's one of the views of this, that television and watching television is helping us to do that. I'm recalling the title of the book by Marie Wynn, I think it is,
The Plug-in
Drug, which I think is a tremendous title, but I think that she takes a very different or negative view of all of this. And the way I understood that was, she says then that what is happening is we've got an overbalance at the left side of the brain. The rational side isn't getting developed at all, and claiming that that's why people can't argue logically anymore, and that's why the test scores are going down in college entrance exams and so on, and that we really are creating a group of people who are more zombie-like, or who are not able to function as whole people, and the rational side isn't developed. I must say that without knowing the data, and I know there's arguments on both sides of this, but when I watch little kids watching cartoons on Saturday morning, and I look at their blank faces, I somehow have a negative feeling. Intuitively, I'm saying to myself, something's wrong with this. I'd be much happier if those kids were out playing creatively or doing something else or reading a book. They look blank. They look as though they're transported off into some other fantasy kind of world, and I just can't believe that ends up being healthy for them. Now, I guess Marie Wynn tries to document that or show that indeed something bad is happening here. So we're getting really two viewpoints right away, aren't we, Mike? We're seeing that McLuhan's representing a positive viewpoint, that we're getting the symbolic right hemisphere side of the brain developed by watching television, thus becoming whole people and getting rooted again in symbols and the tribal culture and all. And here's Marie Wynn representing the other side of this, saying that, well, we are being diminished and hurt by watching too much television.
Right. I don't want to be too hard on Marie Wynn, but her book is really all downhill after the title, and it strikes me that her evidence is pretty weak. The problem with a lot of the arguments that she articulates, and a lot of other people who I would call anti-mass media articulate, is the fact that the same arguments have been used against all of the media in their history, including print, and so that they're always looking for a kind of explanation for why things aren't going the way we are. Take a very simple thing like the children watching the cartoons, and you're concerned about their blank look. And I guess to some extent I am too, but that may be because we come from a much more linear culture than our children do, and that the children of our contemporary age. It seems to me, though, that if we saw that child sitting in church with that same blank look on their face, we probably wouldn't say nothing is going on there. It seems to me it's the context within which we see the child, which is watching television, that causes us to conclude that nothing is going on. The theorists, like McLuhan, would suggest that a lot is going on, that it's not a passive experience, it's a very active experience, that the child is not only actively participating in that event, they are helping to create the event, that without the child watching it, the event would not exist. And so there's that kind of a relationship there.
Do you think it's the same way with radio, Mike? I know it always often has been said that radio is an imaginative medium where we are supplying a lot and filling in, and that television takes that away from us. But you're suggesting that isn't true, huh?
I'm saying there are different kinds of imagination. The golden age of radio certainly sparked the human imagination. There's no question about that. But it wasn't the only way in which the human imagination has ever been sparked. So television is approaching and dealing with the human imagination and activating it, acting as a catalyst for it in different ways than radio did. They're both viable. In fact, I think that's one of the flaws with contemporary radio, that it doesn't really play off of some of its strengths as much as it could. And it has more potential, in other words, than in many cases is being really exploited.
I think that this idea that somehow modes of perceiving or the ways of dealing with the world are being changed, that we find this in the classroom as teachers. Let's take this one example, that in the past that maybe students seem to be more susceptible to logical argumentation, and that today they are very comfortable at flitting from one example to the other. They're not always that interested in tying things together. Mm-hmm. They seem comfortable, I think, from watching television with the quick takes and the quick shift of perspective to from another angle to see something, just like they're getting on television. They're watching Kojak, and he's here suddenly, and then there's a cut quickly, and then another scene comes on. Right. And I have the feeling that that's true. Sometimes I've tried to use this approach in my lectures, in which if I have an hour lecture to give, I will lecture for 20 minutes and then take like what is comparable to a commercial break, a time out where people to talk one-to-one, and it almost functions that way as a reminder of what television is doing. Or maybe better put, that television has programmed us to think like that in shorter segments of time, and as a result, that we in the teaching field maybe have to play to that.
Right. Or that television has changed our cultural rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're in a different tempo now, and I think we have to realize that.
That'd be an interesting topic to explore at some length, Mike. Maybe I shouldn't have brought that up, and maybe we could talk another time about that whole business of the rhythm. Yeah, because it certainly has done that. But let's save that.
Okay.
Let's look at another thing that I see often raised as a criticism, and that is the question of violence on television. I know there's a book out that I was just looking at a review. It's called Television and Youth, 25 Years of Research and Controversy by John P. Murray, I guess. And the claim here is that they've been studying this over a long period of time, and then he says 92% of all children's programming includes some form of violence. And he thinks that as a result, that people are becoming more used to violence, I guess, and that maybe it's one of the factors in that we have seemingly a more violent culture today. Yeah. Now, I guess I know there's another group called Action for Christian Television.
Action for Children's Television.
For Children's Television, yeah, which is trying to attend to the violence also, among other things, in these children's programming.
Right. Well, the idea, the whole topic of violence is one that deserves a whole series of shows in many ways, because the RAND Corporation a few years ago did a survey, and there was over 2,000 serious scholarly articles published within the last decade on violence on television alone. It's certainly a major topic. The conclusion of almost all of those 2,000 articles was that the relationship between television and violence is inconclusive. In essence, television will probably cause some people under some conditions to perhaps behave violently. That's possible. But that's true of almost any trigger mechanism, will eventually cause somebody to behave in some fashion. There's several problems here. One is the definition of violence. If you say that 92% of children's programming contains some violence, my guess would be 92% of any programming contains violence. We don't wish violence away. It's a question, seems to me, of not whether we have enough. It's not a question of whether we have sex or violence on television. It seems to me it's a question of whether we have enough of the right kind. It's a question of how it's presented.
How it's presented, the slant that it's taken. I do believe that some of the literature that I see on this suggests that is what needs to be done. Their feeling is that very often the violence is presented in a way that either glorifies the criminal or puts suggestive ideas in the minds of youngsters.
But the human price for violence were presented effectively. How could anybody argue with that? Nobody, for example, criticizes the violent ending of Hamlet. I mean, I can't think of a more violent play than Hamlet. No one is indicting Shakespeare for violence. It's really a question of how it's presented.
That's right. All through literature we've had this. The arts have always presented violence in one way or another. But what we've usually felt, isn't it, that good art somehow redeems that, transforms it, or puts it into a framework within which we can understand it. For some reason I'm thinking about the movie Clockwork Orange.
Yes.
And I thought that was a terrible movie, my own viewpoint of it, on this very question, because it ritualized violence. Here you had violence being done to Beethoven's music. And it almost took away its sharpness. It took away the terrible kind of character, to me anyway, of what violence was doing. And that sort of represents to me the faulty way of treating violence. It's ritualized. It's almost like it becomes okay because it's got nice musical background and you don't see the real hurt that's coming because people are acting violently.
Well, I think that becomes a problem in certain of the media. But there's a film critic in Chicago by the name of Roger Ebert, who is relatively well known because of his program on public television called Sneak Previews. But Roger Ebert had a theory which I thought was well worth considering. He did a review of a film called Death Wish, which is a story of a New York advertising executive who is a pacifist until his wife and daughter are brutally handled by some really psychotics in the streets of New York, and he then seeks vengeance on these people and literally kills muggers. That's what he does. What Roger Ebert was concerned about was when he saw the film in Chicago, he noticed that the audience actually cheered when Charlie Bronson would shoot down a mugger in the streets of New York, and it worried him a great deal. And he sat down and considered this, though, and he said, now, one of the functions of violence has always been to act as a kind of catharsis for the society. So what films like Death Wish may well have done for the early 70s was to restructure the world in such a way that the people who watched the film could learn how to deal with violence. To put it more concretely, the people could leave the theater maybe a little better able to deal with that chaos that they have to deal with every day because they've seen it contextualized within a film like Death Wish.
So this is the other side of the argument. Again, on each of these points, we're really seeing two different viewpoints. And Mike, in previous conversations with you, I know that you've told me that a lot of the research really is inconclusive on many of these questions. In other words, we just can't quite pin it all down yet, probably because we're dealing with a medium that is relatively young, and we haven't had time to do the research or the study. Right. But again, on this violence question, then we have two sides. One is saying that, yes, it's a catalyst for violence, it causes it, youngsters see it, and then they want to go out and do it. Other people are arguing that really it is a vicarious way of getting rid of violent tendencies, that you're seeing it on the television, and it's acted out there for you, and you can identify with this violence and therefore in a sense get it out of your system. Right. And therefore it will keep some people from being violent. One might, as a quick layman in the field, hazard the opinion that probably both things happen. That's probably the research is probably indicating this, that some people are going to react in one of those two ways.
I think you have to, when you're dealing with that kind of programming, you have to be very careful as to how you present it. But I think for the general producer of television programming, they well know what the general effect is going to be on the audience, and they have to use their good judgment and their good sense.
Well, we can't presume that they're always using good judgment.
No, but we hope they are.
Yeah, but isn't it true that a lot of the violence on television is not being presented in some sort of a redeeming way, or?
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I look at a book called TV Ethics for Hire by Robert Alley, which in there he really did a survey of a wide range of television programs, including a whole series of interviews with television producers. And he found, as I think most people who worked with television producers have found, that they generally are just like you and I, concerned people. They basically, live in a family environment. They're concerned about what they do. If they had their druthers, they would choose to do that which is best for the society.
Yeah, but they have to make money.
They also have to make money. That's right. They also have to make money. But it's hard to point to a single television program in which violence or crime are really rewarded. 99% of the time, those actions, what I would call gratuitous violence, crime,
I don't think myself that it's so much if it's rewarded or not. And I don't know that much about it. I haven't watched that much television to be able to say whether that happens or not. I think it's more this perspective in which it's viewed, whether one feels in any sense the emotions involved as the result of violence. That was my problem with Clockwork Orange. One doesn't sense how people are suffering as a result of it. You don't see the after effects of this violent action.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another thing about it that bothers me, and that is the question of the fact that in television, disputes are often settled by violence. Well, we have this in our movies, and it's a general way in the United States. You get out the six-gun and shoot somebody. But that how often do disputes between individuals get solved by dialogue, for example? And I think that might be a way that we might offer a criticism here.
Well,
I want to get back, before we get off that other point, that idea of these people who are doing this programming and so on as being nice people. Well, I think anybody who's caught up in any kind of a system, for the most part, they're nice people. But that doesn't absolve the system. I mean, the whole structure could be screwed up and really a mess, but the people be very nice in it. But the system itself ends up hurting people. And I don't think that absolves television just on its own that way.
No, it doesn't, but it does put it in perspective, because I think the tendency is to view people who work for networks, for example, as the devil incarnate, and they're accused essentially of being capitalistic, violence mongers, and that's simply not the case. They really are, regular folks. They are caught up in a system, and the system demands certain kinds of things of them and of the corporations for which they work. But they're nonetheless concerned within their realm, and it's possible. And I guess I don't think the television programming has been given a fair shake. I don't think it's been presented fairly. I don't think the analysis of it that's been done has been very fair, because it's not been very thorough. That's my problem with a lot of the work that's been done.
Yes. It would be fair to say that you are fairly positive on a lot of on television and what it's doing and so on, and shaping our psyche. Do you find yourself more on the side of McLuhan in this argument and against Marie Wynne, and more on the side of saying the violence functions positively?
Well, I would hope that I find myself more on the side of people like Teilhard de Chardin, talking about the point where we're all going to come together at some great omega point. I don't really think, in other words, of this as de-evolution. I see this whole process as evolutionary.
One of the things is for sure is television is here, and we can't get into the situation of trying to wish it away or so on, although I do know some families who try to control the watching of their television, and that's probably good.
And I think there's a problem there, too. If and as some parents have told me, I have taken the television set away from my children. Well, it seems to me that's a pretty radical movement, a pretty radical act. It also, by the way, I think is a bit unfair to the child. You're taking away that which you should help him learn how to use, learn how to deal with. Don't eliminate the problem.
Because he's going to be watching it later on anyway.
Well, he's going to be affected by it, because the children that he goes to school with, the children that he plays with, they're all going to have television as part of their experience. And so I think you're being unfair. In fact, your culture is depriving that child. And I think that's something which a lot of people don't really understand or don't completely grasp.
Let's take up another thing. We're trying to look at the way television shapes our consciousness, right? What about the question of escapism? I have the feeling that what happens in the television thing is a problem is presented, and then it ends up being solved in a relative short period of time. And I have the feeling that somehow that influences people, that they think that all human problems are solvable in a short period of time. Well, it seems to me it ends up being sort of an escape from the complexity of the world.
Right. That is the heart of the anti-television argument. That is that people somehow are led to escape into a new world. And I think the problem isn't really one of escaping. It's really the television as a popular art functions like all other arts. It restructures the world. It takes us off into that restructured world and helps us deal with problems that we normally couldn't deal with, and then puts us back into the real world. So the escapism there is not a negative, but a positive. We need that kind of escapism. Most of us probably couldn't survive an evening of documentaries. we have enough documentaries 9 to 5.
I'm not sure the word escapism was the right word there to use. I guess it's the moving away from the complexity of the world, that of thinking that a problem can be presented and solved, that all human problems are solvable somehow, and that it can be done in this brief period of time. That's more my problem with it.
And
I feel like a lot of young people I deal with are into that and sort of think of their world in that way. And if the consciousness is being shaped like that, I have real great questions about it.
But again, I'm not sure that it is. If we take a quick program that's very successful, like All in the Family, it took 7 years for us to really completely understand that family. Those characters changed and developed. Problems were not solved overnight. They were solved over a long period of time. The relationship between Archie and his son-in-law and his daughter took a long time to be solved, if it ever was. And I think that a program like that shows that television can operate in a kind of organic sense over an extended period of time instead of in short segments, which is the normal accusation against such programming. The time frame is important.
Mike, it's good talking with you. You obviously are an expert on all of this. I come at it as a layman and as a theologian, but all of this conversation seems very important to me because it is vital to know how we perceive our world, how we're functioning as human beings. One of my thoughts is that very few people think much about television and the way it is affecting us. Now, out of our conversation, I think I get this, that we really are being affected in some way. That McLuhan was right many years ago in saying that the media does determine our modes of perceiving our world, and that somehow we're different as a result of this living in this television age. Now, exactly how we're different isn't clear. I think we've seen arguments on both sides. A lot of the stuff I read seems to be negative and saying that, it's creating a more violent atmosphere and keeping us from thinking rationally and moving us to a sort of escapism and thinking we can solve problems easily. And what I'm getting from you in the conversation is always a counter-argument of saying, well, yeah, but wait a second, maybe it's really making us whole people. Maybe it's helping us to deal with violence better. Maybe it isn't so escapism that we really need that kind of things in our lives. So I guess what I get out of it is that there needs to be a lot more thought about this and more research done so we really can know for religious theological purposes what it is that television is doing to us.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Michael Marsden, Associate Professor of Popular Culture at Bowling Green State University. The topic of this week's Reflections was the way television shapes our consciousness. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.